Okay. Segon, Sewagwegon. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our second annual Student Science Indigenous Scientist Chats. My name is Jenna Barnhart, and I'm the Indigenous Research Assistant for Student Science. If this is your first time hearing about us, we are a subsidiary initiative launched out of Ryerson University's Sci Exchange program in 2019. Our objective has been to promote science outreach, science knowledge mobilization, and knowledge translation combined with traditional Indigenous teachings to Indigenous students. Throughout the years, we've been working hard to offer science outreach programming specifically to Indigenous youth. If you're interested in hearing more about our past and future programming, you can find us on social media platforms. All the platforms are here under Sci Exchange RU or on our website at ryerson.ca/sci-exchange/Indigenous outreach. For today's program, we have generously been able to welcome our speaker, Anong Beam, who is the founder of Beam Paints, where she creates plastic-free paint and watercolors inspired by culture. But I'll let her tell you more about her background and her experience. So welcome, Anong.
Hey, hello. I can't quite see. Can you see me okay? Okay, David. Ani, hello. My name is Anong Migwans Beam, and I'm from Chiging First Nation, and I'm speaking to you from our shop in Chiging First Nation on Manitoulin Island. I'm a Anishinaabe from the Migwans family, and I'm really excited to get to talk to you about the long journey I had realizing my career in science through paint making. And it took me a really long time to kind of put things together, and hopefully sharing this with you might help you look at a few different options in your life. Growing up, I was really fortunate to learn a lot of traditional paint making techniques from my mom and dad. And my dad, Carl Beam, was an Indigenous artist. He was the first Indigenous painter to have his work purchased into the National Gallery as a contemporary artist. So he did modern, contemporary artwork, not traditional style. But he did do traditional art in ceramics and pigment collecting. So we spent a lot of my youth driving around, going into gravel pits and rock cuts and looking for minerals. And that kind of led to this understanding about geology and different ways that different things on the surface that might show how something might be underneath, and understanding geology in that way. And I absorbed all that as a kid in a traditional way, you know, when you're learning from elders or family, and a lot of other elders that my dad visited learning in his journey learning. But at that time, in those times, Indigenous knowledge wasn't regarded or respected in the way that we're coming to understand it now. And I didn't really know that I had learned something of value for my life in the modern world, I suppose. And at that time, the internet, you know, it wasn't a thing. And I felt very isolated on my First Nation here. There weren't jobs for people like me in the creative industries. I really felt that if I was going to have a career or a job that was satisfying, I would have to leave my community. And I did. I went to school in the Southwest at Institute of American Indian Arts. And ultimately, I went to a lot of different schools, but I didn't connect with those communities. I didn't have my family there. And I eventually came back to Chiging, and I had 2 sons here. And, you know, I had a bit of a bumpy beginning, and I ended up being a single mom here in Chiging. And it was kind of at that point I started wanting to make paint, and I started going to learn how to do it in like the proper way. And that kind of meant like the European measured way of doing things. I started researching that and doing it. And as I was buying all this material to try it out and learn how to make paint, I realized I already knew how to make paint, and that the material that I was buying, it was shipped from France or came from somewhere else. It wasn't any different than the earths and things that I understood how to gather myself. The certain ones were, but the basic thing of it I knew how to do. And it was really funny. It was like a light bulb went on, and I just realized, oh, and I think that's a big thing for understanding the difference between uh, colonial view, colonialized learning, where you go into a European thought structure and at the end you receive a certificate. And the certificate says, you know this, and then you're licensed and approved to go about it. Whereas Indigenous knowledge transmissions don't produce a certificate. And that means that you have to be more sensitive with yourself and with other people who've learned in a traditional way, because it's something that you give yourself that authority, or the authority is given to you in a traditional way. It's I'm glad that we're coming into a time that recognizes that. And it's funny to realize that even within myself, I couldn't really recognize that for a long time. So when I started making paint, realizing that duality of looking at how to make something in a European tradition versus how to make it in an Indigenous tradition, I just found that there was so much of value on both sides. On the scientific European tradition of paint making, there were a lot of advances in non-toxic synthetics that could make vivid, beautiful colors. And I found a lot of joy and satisfaction in combining from a Western tradition and Indigenous tradition and putting them together. And that's kind of how I developed this, is kind of how we do paint. It doesn't look anything like, you know, European or Western style paint manufacturers, because we're using birch or pine or cedar, and we use paper and waxed canvas. As I started rolling along with that, I realized there was just so many ways that they could, the two approaches could work together to make really great paint. So the number one goal is to make great paint, but we don't want to use plastic. So instead of plastic, we use reclaimed wood. And then thinking about Plains traditions and how Plains people used parfleche, pieces of rawhide folded and birch bark folded to carry things. We kind of came up with this. It's our design of a half pan of paint. Regular paint manufacturers will just put this in a little plastic tub, and then that plastic tub goes in a plastic box. But we have this piece of pine that's finished with beeswax, and this paper or canvas wrapped paint that inspired by a parfleche design goes into this holder. So we can have a similar experience without using plastic or petroleum products. So I really enjoy thinking about things like that and sharing natural materials with people. This is like a pencil holder we made, and doing things like that. I didn't really realize at the time when I was in high school, I didn't think of science as I didn't understand or think that science could relate to art. And it's been really exciting for me to explore that. As a paint manufacturer, there's a lot of stuff that I do on a everyday basis that is so related to science and chemistry class. I was going to show you the containers I use for making paint. This is a new one. I haven't gotten it dirty yet, but this is the one that's been well used. So we use graduated cylinders and beakers and also respirators with really good vapor cartridges, eye protection, all of those kinds of things from science class we use. And the scientific method, I even had to go back to that, developing paint recipes that I now, Beam Paints and me for years have been working on plastic-free paint recipes. So this room that I'm in right now, the walls behind us is all painted with house paint made out of hemp. It's entirely plant-based, and we made house paint that there's no plastic or solvents in it. And I have a patent pending for that recipe. And that was really exciting to work through. I didn't think that someone like me could be a scientist or have a patent or be an inventor. I'd only heard of inventors really in comic books and cartoons, and Donald Duck's cousin Gyro Gearloose had patents and was an inventor, or I guess now Iron Man, things like that. But you can take your creativity and your curiousness into any area and start asking questions about how can we improve how this is done. And really, that's what I do and how I've started my business, is looking at my small corner of the world, particularly art supplies, and saying, how can we do this better? How can I imagine, especially thinking about my culture and ancestors, how my tradition looks at the natural world, how can I imagine this in a different way? And how can we do this without plastic has been particularly my real thrill. And yeah, it's been really challenging. I do wish that I paid more attention in science class, especially having to develop recipes and write down the steps that I'm taking, and then specifically measure. All of those things have come back into my life now, how to measure volume versus measuring by weights or measuring by volume, and keeping notes. And you'll be making paint and you do one thing slightly different and it comes out completely different. So there's a lot of writing down processes and weights and measures and what gets mixed into what at what point. So that's that's a bit about my journey into paint making and science. And I don't really know how long I've talked there. 20 minutes. Is that good? Or will you edit this pause out?
Yeah, we can. You can talk a little bit about being Indigenous. I mean, you mentioned a lot of the science behind it, and a lot of the questions we have from people are kind of like, as an Indigenous person, what kind of what inspired this career? Like, a lot of the students want to know, like, as someone who's Indigenous, what's the post-secondary look like for the arts, and like what were some of the challenges that you may be faced with kind of getting to where you are now from an Indigenous perspective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess okay, so just go from here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think the challenges with I think the biggest challenge was that I didn't imagine that there was a future like this for me. And so much had to change. The fact that we're connected, the the growth of the internet and the way it's connected us to everybody. I started after I started making paint, I started sharing what I was doing on Instagram and with other people and getting feedback from other people that way. And then started an online store selling paint to people who thought it was interesting. And I never could have done that before, now with the way global commerce has changed to connect everybody, I'm able to work and stay in my home community and develop industry and jobs here. And that's something that's really time has given that as a gift to the world. And I don't really feel that we all I don't really feel like it's people don't understand how easy it is now to start an online business and to become part of a more global community. Online, I really found so many people who were interested in pigment and who were looking at different ways of making paint. And I think that helped me understand how privileged I was to have an upbringing in traditional pigments. Um, my dad, going around with him, visiting people and other artisans, he went to lots of different reserves and reservations in the States, pueblos, and was always looking for people who had traditional pigment knowledge, and he would be trading with them. I remember once we went in the station wagon up to First Mesa at Hopi, and he traded with Dewey and Juanita Healy, who were ceramic artists there. He traded bearskins and tins full of coffee for a coffee can full of these specific paint rocks. And it was just kind of growing up with that kind of respect and honor to the earth, like the connection to be able to walk out and see that a lot of the pictographs that we have up in the North Shore area, Agawam Canyon pictographs, those were done by our ancestors, untold amounts of time ago. And that pigment is still there and visible and beautiful. And those are, that's something that it's not really talked about very much, that Indigenous people, we had our own science and our own approaches. I think in those days when I was in high school, I didn't feel I didn't see myself anywhere. There wasn't a lot of representation, I guess that's what it comes down to. I didn't see a lot of business women or women in the arts who were starting businesses. There was a really wonderful person here, a woman who started a business selling computers, and I bought my first computer from her when I was maybe 12 or 13. So kind of digress a little bit. I don't know, like university and all of that has changed so much now. There's connections for Indigenous knowledge, and there's a lot of really great people who are working to make our traditional viewpoints known at the university and college level. So I think that there's a lot more support for that kind of creativity now. I think the important thing is to know that you can ask for that, and that you can ask for supports. You're gonna have to point me back on the question again about
Yeah, no problem. We actually have a lot of questions regarding like a lot of our students are interested in that kind of educational journey into the arts. Um,
Okay.
you're right, it's very different now, but a lot of other questions actually relate to what's involved in the paint making process. Like, how do you make paints from natural pigments? One person even asked, like, what makes the paint stick to the paper? Like, how is this different than for example, you were talking about the commercial made paints and with all the plastics and everything, like can I know a lot of you can't give away your recipes, but like, can
Yeah,
you?
yeah. No. I can talk about that for sure.
Yeah.
So the kind of paint that we make is watercolor paint. And watercolor paint is really wonderful because it's naturally is a plant-based paint. It comes with kind of understanding the basics of paint is that all kinds of paints are really made up of two things. There's something called a vehicle and a pigment. And a vehicle means it's the substance that you put the colored powder into. And then the vehicle determines how the paint is going to behave, what kind of paint you're going to have at the end. So if you use a water soluble tree gum to make paint, you're going to have like watercolor that you can put some water on and it'll activate and you can paint with it. If you use an acrylic polymer and you put pigment into that, you're going to have an acrylic paint that's made out of acrylic. And if you use an oil base, that's your vehicle, then you put pigment and you're going to have an oil paint at the end. So you have your vehicle and you have your pigment. Pigment is really a fascinating thing because there's so many different ways to understand it and look at it, and there are so many different ways to collect or achieve pigments. And it really depends on what your value is and what you want the paint to do and what kind of story you want it to tell, where it's coming from. You can make paint from anything. I recently had representatives from the Royal Ontario Museum send me a piece of a meteorite, and then they wanted me to make a paint out of that. And that was really, really exciting. It wasn't the most ideal material to make paint out of, but we got it done. And you can also likewise make paint out of hollyhocks or grass or tea or coffee or grapes. If there's anything could be turned into paint. But then it's what kind of paint. Not everything can be turned into a light fast paint, for example. And light fast just means that the pigments are such that they could be out, withstand a lot of direct sunlight and be unchanged. And that's the gold standard for me, for us at Beam Paints, is that we want to make professional artist grade light fast paints. And that's tricky. Not everything is professional and light fast. Like a good example is maybe like Crayola marker drawings. And if you do those and then they go into a cupboard or a shelf somewhere, 20 years from now, a lot of those colors won't be there anymore because those are just dyes. It's easy to make a color exist in the moment, but to make a color that can preserve and last for longevity, the same way that the pigments in Agua Canyon pictographs, they've lasted for centuries, and to have that longevity, that's part of the art form. And we do kind of a hybrid between Indigenous pigment gathering and then also the Western approach to pigments, especially with some of the synthetic colors. I find making paint, each is a closer description of a pigment is something, it can't be washed away from itself, which is it's always been fascinating to me that, you think when you put paint in a bucket of water and you wash it away and the water carries it away, but it's more that as a solution, the pigment can become dispersed in air and waterborne, but it never fully integrates with water. And when you're preparing pigments to make paint, a common step in that is washing the pigment and then letting it settle, and then the water gets poured off and the pigment remains. You can clean pigments by washing them in water because they'll never join the water. They'll settle and the water will go off, and what's left is the pigment. That's the big difference between a pigment and a dye. A dye will disperse and solubilize into a fluid like water. And dyes can be light fast. This is where you get into the whole science of that, whether it's soluble in water or soluble in alcohol or oil, and different kinds of recipes for making things. But some of the other things you can make paints out of, you can make ink from iron gall, or that's like a growth on an acorn tree, or sumac, or black walnuts. We use a lot of limestone and different ochres and earths from Manitoulin. Even when we use synthetic colors, we tend to pair them with an earth pigment that matches. And I find that combination of our earth pigments and synthetics makes for a really unique paint. All of these pigments, once they become isolated and cleaned, they have completely different physical qualities, every single one of them. So we can have, say, a recipe for watercolor, but that same base recipe will have to change 50 times if you're making 50 different colors. And that's about what we have, about 52 colors right now. And it's about 52 different recipes. Some of the colors, you mix them up and they behave like stringy, syrupy goop, and other ones are like almost like whipping cream. Some of them are really hard, like toffee. They all have really different physical properties to them, and that's a lot of fun for me to play with that. Get to play with them every day. Oh, can you go back to the question again?
Yeah, I think you answered quite a bit of that, but there was one part that they asked that says, how do you achieve a wide range of colors with natural materials? But I guess you kind of touched on that with the synthetic that you use.
Yeah, we do. We use synthetics. I think it's really important. I think a lot of times there's this expectation, because I'm Indigenous, that everything we use is going to be right from out of my garden or under my porch somewhere. And I think I try to be really clear with people that we're an Indigenous company and we're rooted in our values and respect for the earth. And a big part of that is why we use synthetics, because in earth, there's this kind of like, right now, there's a real back to nature kind of movement in the world. People want to get back to clean, natural things, but they don't really realize that in paint, all of the most vivid colors naturally found are really heavily toxic. Like red, cadmium will make a really beautiful red, and cobalt will make a beautiful blue, but those are all heavy metals and they're really, really toxic for you. My dad passed away pretty early, and when he was ill, they found that his system, he had a lot of heavy metals in his system. And I think that was in part from the art supplies he used. So I try to bring a bit of awareness to people about working safe, understanding your materials, making sure that you choose paints that you know what's in them, because I think a lot of people don't really understand that heavy metals, once they get in your system, they persist and they accumulate. You don't shed them. So it's really important to be careful around them. Luckily, though, science has come up with alternatives that are non-toxic, and we were one of the smallest companies to join the Art and Creative Materials Institute. That's a group that's of toxicologists that administer and arrange third-party testing so that you can have toxicologists go over your materials and make sure that everything is really safe, especially for kids. So all of our colors are third-party tested by Cambridge Materials Testing and Duke University toxicologists to make sure it's safe for kids.
Great. So some of the other questions kind of relate to more your kind of day-to-day, or what you do as a businesswoman. And some of the questions are kind of vague, but some of them you've already touched on a little bit, such as like, what gave you the idea for creating like beam paints, and like the products that you have in beam paints? Like, what gave you the ideas for creating these things?
It's really been a journey, and it's been a journey, and it's been something where I think the reason why you can look at it now and see there are so many different kinds of products and paints and ideas that we make and sell. But it really just started with a couple things with this and with that. And then over time, we've expanded what we make. And also, there was a lot of there's a lot of going back to the drawing board. In the very beginning, the paint that I made, it wasn't any good. And I had some tough, not criticism, but commentary from people, a store and some people I really respect that tried it out, and they're like, it's not that great. And I think something that's really important is to not be discouraged by negative feedback. And ever since the very beginning, when I found that out, I stopped making paint. I looked at everything, and I really reevaluated, reformulated, and redid absolutely everything I was doing in the early days. And I kind of kept that same attitude as I kept moving forward, that when something went wrong or I got bad feedback, I really paid attention to it, and I let people know that I value that, and that thank you so much for taking time out of your day to let me know that there was something that wasn't 100%, or that it was bad in some way. And because if you ever get a gift of somebody telling you that, then you can address it. But if you don't know, you don't know. So you really have to make a way to not be personally hurt by negative feedback, but to take it as a clue on where you can strengthen your processes, your responses, your product, whatever it is. We have a discount code that we give out to people if they find a mistake in our website, or they find something wrong, or any list of the millions of things that can and do go wrong all the time. We always address it with a lot of trying to be humble, and we definitely know that we can't be perfect. And the idea is more to just keep growing and involving people in that process. So it's really fun to dialogue with people about what they're looking for, try our best to support that, maybe do have some mistakes, find out about them. And sometimes that leads that's really kind of how we've developed our product offerings, is through that kind of back and forth feedback.
Oh, that's really interesting. What would you say, and this is just a question of mine off of that, but what would you say is something that was inspired by feedback, like directly inspired by feedback that you felt you created because your client base or your customers really wanted something and it was missing from this industry? Or was there any specific product that you have?
Um, yeah, I would almost say the watercolor. Because when I started making paint, I personally paint with oil paints. And I started making oil paints and it didn't really go very well. And then I started making watercolor because people were interested in that and had asked. And then the first bunch of watercolors that I made were really bad. And it took a really strong woman in the industry actually told me, you know what, these are no good. And, it's really hard to keep going when somebody tells you that right to your face. And even worse, they're right. And you're like, oh, rats, you got me. But yeah, I kept going with that. I think another thing is that as we started putting paint into plastic-free containers, customers and people asked us what we were doing with the rest of the packaging flow, and that led us to take their suggestions and develop an entirely plastic-free. Because when we first started, we'd make a paint like this and put it in a mailer, those bubble mailers, and that's just a big plastic envelope. It's a lot of plastic in there. And now we take them, we wrap them in craft paper. That also, the customer feedback helped us stop using regular tape, plastic packing tape. We replaced that with water activated paper tape. We really followed those kinds of cues and responses to phase plastic out of all of the aspects of our business. So now it's an awful lot of recycled craft paper.
That's really interesting, and it's nice to know that you've been able to grow with by using that kind of feedback. So that's really interesting. Another question we have here, it's kind of overarching, but what's the best part of what you do, and what does your day-to-day look like? Are you always creating paints, or is it more things?
Well, the best part of what I do, I think it's two things really. I really enjoy, maybe three things. I really enjoy making paint. To be physically around that much color and paint is just really, really fun. And I have moments sometimes I'm just totally by myself over like making paint or mixing a bowl of something, and I'll just have to smile at just how beautiful it is to be around that volume of color. And then secondly, I really love that I get to do this at home. My studio in the business is all here around my house, and so I'm in Sheen. I'm on, this is the house I grew up in, and downstairs is where my room was when I was a little kid. And we're here in Sheen. This has been our family's land since they signed the treaty for this area. So my dad was born just around next on the other side of that hill and in a log cabin. And his, it's been a family place. So I'm happy to be here in my community. My cousins are here. My sons go to school just up the road. And I have that connection to family and place is really, really important to me. It strengthens me and helps me. That's what's helped me build a business. I get to work with a lot of family, And being a family business has made entrepreneurship so much easier for me. I would have had a tough time away from my community and my culture and my supports. It feels good to do this here. Also, it's kind of a bit of a farm. I have a few cows and chickens and turkeys here, so it's a really nice environment. I wake up, I go outside, I let the chickens out of their coop, I see the turkeys, look at the cows, have a few goats, and then I see the kids off to school. I make paint. I see everybody at the shop. There's the ladies who are packing paint and the guys who are making pallets and things. And I make whatever kind of color they need. Right now, I need to be making purple. And then I have some lunch and you walk around a bit. I'm outdoors a lot, looking at things, wood or materials. And the kids come back. I have it's a pretty well balanced life. We work like a 4-day work week, but we spread it out over 5 days so that we have a few moms in our staff, and that helps them stay balanced with picking up their kids and going to make supper and all of that. So we're done work at 3, and it's been really exciting to develop a business where I can feel proud of the kind of employer that we are. We're a living wage employer, so we pay more than minimum wage. We kind of try to pay what it costs to live up here. Everybody in the north knows how much it costs to get a brick of cheese.
Yeah, definitely. That's really great. Another interesting question someone had is, what surprised you the most about making paints?
When I started, somebody told me, oh, all these pigments, they have these different personalities. And I remember kind of going, yeah, I get it. They have different personalities. They're different colors, sure. But I didn't understand that they were physically different, like characters. What I kind of said before about how some can be super stringy, like toffee, and then other ones can be like whipping cream. And they're all so different. Some of them repel away from water. Some of them absorb and go to water, so they're hydrophilic or hygroscopic, I think. And that's been really interesting to get to know the physical qualities of all these different pigments and to understand that world a bit better.
That's so cool. On that note, though, what's your favorite one? Like, what's your favorite pigment or color, or the one with the most interesting personality, I guess?
Oh, gee. Well, there's a few that are pretty interesting. Like ultramarine blue is a really beautiful color. It's a synthetic color that's made to replace crushed azurite. So back in the Renaissance times, the only way to get that really beautiful sky blue was like crushed semi-precious stones. It was really, really expensive. So they would only use that once in a while. And that's why when you see their religious paintings, Mary has the blue on it because that was the most expensive color. Then the synthetic version of it was developed with around lime kilns. And there's a really interesting story about how they figured that out. And so now we have this beautiful blue that's non-toxic, and it's powdered. And to say it's synthetic, it's not like synthetic means it was imported from space or somehow it's not real. It just means that there was a process that was made, that these were made through a recipe. Like you can even view iron oxide as a synthetic, because when you have an iron nail and it rusts out onto the earth, an action is taking place that creates that. So that's the same with these pigments. And a lot of times it's an oxidation reaction between a metal, and then it's oxidizing in the presence of a salt or something, and then these different pigments arrive. So ultramarine blue is really interesting. When I mix it with the binder, you get this really kind of smell. It almost smells like cut flower stems. You have that kind of floral smell to it, and then that one is super sticky and it's really easy to mix, and I like mixing that one the most and kind of playing with it.
Nice. That's really interesting how each color kind of has its own story. Was there any particular color that was really, really challenging, like you thought you would never kind of figure it out?
Oh, I feel like that all the time actually, because we're working through different kinds of paints, and right now we're working on tubed paints that are it's like a replacement for acrylic paint, but it's based off of hemp. And now I'm making that kind of paint that goes in a tube out of the same pigments that I use to make watercolor. But because it's a different recipe, all these characters that I've met, like 50 different characters, they all behave completely differently once the vehicle was changed. So that's been interesting. I was just making yellow. You can kind of tell I'm still a little bit yellow green, and I was trying to make it for this other paint, and it was like meeting a totally different person. It's like I thought I knew you, and no.
Interesting. Okay, the last question here is,
Mhm.
what piece of advice would you have given your younger self when you were trying to decide or start this career?
Ah, well, I think it's really important who you surround yourself with, because your work ethic and the way the rest of your life is going to affect how much energy you have to give to yourself and to give to your business. And in the beginning, and even now, this is a lot of work. And to get it going started in the beginning, I had to work really hard. I was supporting 2 kids. I had a full-time job, and I was starting this. So there was a lot of early mornings and late nights and, just persevering. But I had good people around me, and they had good work ethics, and we are really clean living. I think, you know, making healthy life choices was supremely important, because otherwise there just wasn't enough, there couldn't be enough energy to give to being a solid parent and being an entrepreneur. These are things that take all of your time and focus, and you need a good support team. So uh, I see a huge difference in how far I came when I had people who weren't really stable in my life, versus later when I met my new partner, my boyfriend. And stability is really important. If you can carve that out for yourself, you have to put yourself first like that.
That's really great. Well, that's all of our guest questions that I have. If there's nothing else that you want to mention, um, thank you so much for being part of our scientist chats this year. And we will upload this recording for all of our viewers, and we will add Anong's contact information or her social media, whatever she's comfortable sharing, so that everyone can have a look at what she does and look more into your work and some more information about you. So yeah, that will be posted. And thanks everyone for joining us. Until next year. Thanks, Anon.
Awesome. Miigwech.